When Sarah came home from the cemetery, the lock on the orchard gate had been changed. She stood at the entrance to the apple orchard, the one her husband David had tended for 30 years, the one his grandfather had planted nearly a century before, and looked at the new padlock on the iron gate. She understood what it meant before she was ready to understand it fully. Through the bars she could see the house. The front door was open. A man she had never seen before stood on the porch with a measuring tape in his hand. Another was walking the edge of the yard, looking toward the barn. And Richard David's brother, already out of his funeral clothes and into a suit, stood beside them, holding a glass that caught the last of the afternoon light. Then he saw her. He walked to the gate without hurrying. "The orchard has been sold, Sarah," he said. "The buyer wants you out in 48 hours." He said it with the calm satisfaction of a man who had been waiting a long time to say exactly those words. He said it the way people speak when they have spent years believing they were entitled to something that never belonged to them. Sarah said nothing. She stood there at the locked gate of the orchard she had walked through 10,000 times, and she thought of David, of the careful, unhurried way he handled anything that mattered. David had always said the most important kind of preparation was the kind done quietly long before anyone knew it would be needed. Richard had been going through David's study for 3 days. He had sorted the shelves into boxes marked Keep, Donate, and Discard. He had done it quickly, the way a man does things when he believes he has already won. He had not read the books before he sorted them. Somewhere near the curb at the end of the drive in a box marked Discard was an old book about apple cultivation. Worn cover, soft spine. The kind of book David still opened on Sunday mornings when the trees needed tending and he wanted to get it right. And between pages 104 and 105, folded once the crease still sharp, was a document Richard had never known existed. David had known his brother for 50 years. He had been planning for this far longer than Richard had been planning against him. The last paper was still waiting. Sarah just needed to find it first. The cemetery was 20 minutes from the farm. Sarah had walked the same road home for 30 years. The 2-lane county road that ran between the elm trees, past the old feed store, past the Hendersons' mailbox with the painted rooster on top, down the gentle slope where the valley opened, and you could see if the light was right, the rows of apple trees, beginning at the property line and running all the way to the ridge. She had walked it in every season. She knew every turn of it. She was carrying chrysanthemums, the white ones, David's favorites, the ones she had laid on the grave, and then picked back up because she had not been ready to leave them yet, because leaving them felt too final for a Tuesday in October when the apples were just coming into their color and David had only been gone for 11 days. She was still carrying them when she reached the gate. The gate was iron set between 2 stone posts that David's grandfather had placed when he built the original fence in 1924. The latch had a particular sound, a specific click, that Sarah had heard so many times it had become part of the farm's language, one of the sounds that meant home. She reached for it with her key the way she had reached for it 10,000 times. The key did not fit. She tried it again. She checked the ring, the right key, the one she had carried for 30 years, the one David had pressed into her hand the morning they moved in, saying, "Here, Sar, this one's yours." She put it in the lock, and it did not turn, and she stood at the gate of her own farm and understood before she fully understood it what had happened. Through the iron bars she could see the yard. There were cars she did not recognize on the gravel, 3 of them expensive, the kind that belonged to people who drove out from the city to look at things they were considering purchasing. A man in a blazer was photographing the equipment barn with his phone. A woman with a clipboard was walking the fence line along the south orchard. And Richard was in the yard. He was wearing a dark jacket she had not seen at the funeral, a good one pressed the jacket of a man who is dressed for an occasion he has been anticipating. He had a glass in his hand, something sparkling, and he was talking to a man Sarah had never seen before, with the ease of 2 people who have already agreed on something and are now simply enjoying the afternoon. He saw her at the gate. He said something to the man beside him, short, dismissive, and walked over. He did not hurry. He walked the way a man walks when he has already decided the outcome of the conversation and is not concerned about it. He said, "Sarah, I was going to call you." She said, "What is happening, Richard?" He said, "The farm has been sold. I finalized it this morning. The buyer is a development group out of the city. They're going to build residential. Good use of the land, honestly. David always said the orchard was more work than it was worth. She looked at him. David had never said that. David had said the opposite of that in every conversation she had ever heard him have about the orchard for 30 years. She said, "You don't have the authority to sell this property." Richard reached into his jacket and produced a document. He held it out through the gate bars with the patience of a man presenting a settled matter. It was a will, old paper, the kind that has been stored for years, the edges slightly soft with age, David's name at the top. The date, 31 years ago, the year before they were married. She read it where she stood through the bars. The language was simple. In the event of David's death without children, all property and assets to pass to his brother Richard Edward Calloway. She said, "There's a more recent will." Richard said, "I've been through David's study thoroughly. There is no more recent will, Sarah. This is the document on file with the county." He said it with the specific confidence of a man who has done his research. He had been through the study. He had found what he expected to find and had not found what he did not expect. He said David wanted the family name to mean something. He wanted this land to stay in Calloway hands and produce something. He didn't want it spent on. He paused on maintaining a lifestyle for someone who couldn't give him children. She said nothing. She had been married to David for 30 years. She had known for most of those years that Richard had never accepted her, had never accepted the marriage, had never forgiven David for choosing her, had never stopped believing that Sarah's failure to conceive was a failing that David should have addressed by marrying someone else. She had known all of this. David had known it too, and had loved his brother in the complicated way you love someone who disappoints you consistently, but is still, despite everything, your blood. Or he had also, she now understood, taken precautions she had not known about. She could hear it in Richard's certainty. He had planned this. He had waited for David to be in the ground and had moved with the speed of a man executing a plan long developed, and his certainty was the certainty of someone who had checked and found what he was looking for. He had not found what he was not looking for. Behind her, she heard a truck engine. She turned. A moving truck had pulled onto the county road and was backing toward the gate. 2 men climbed out of the cab and looked at Richard. Richard nodded. He said, "Your personal belongings have been boxed up. The truck will take them wherever you want to go. Brenda can help you with arrangements if you need somewhere to stay while you sort things out." Brenda was on the porch. She was watching this from the porch with the particular expression of a woman who has been waiting for a specific outcome and is now watching it arrive. She raised her glass slightly when Sarah's eyes found her. A small gesture, the gesture of a woman who considers the matter concluded. The movers carried a suitcase to the gate and set it on the grass outside. Richard said, "You were a good wife to him, Sarah. But this property belongs to the Calloway family. David meant for it to stay that way. You understand." He said it in the tone of a man explaining something to someone he has already written off. She looked at the suitcase on the grass. She looked at the trucks and the strangers and the clipboard woman in the orchard. She looked at Richard with his glass and his settled certainty and his 31-year-old document. Then she looked at the ground beside the gate. There was a cardboard box there, one of several she could see now stacked outside the gate along the fence line. The contents of David's study she understood. Richard had sorted and discarded. The box nearest to her had been upended. Its contents were scattered in the grass, old magazines, a torn road map, a paperback novel, and a book. Thick spine brown cloth cover worn soft with years of handling, the gilt lettering on the front faded to near invisibility. She could read it from where she stood. Apple Cultivation and Orchard Management, a practical guide. She had seen David reading it on Sunday evenings for 30 years. He had kept it on the corner of his nightstand. She had dusted around it 1,000 times without opening it the way you don't open someone else's professional books because they belong to the person's work and not to you. She heard his voice, the specific, unhurried quality of it, the voice he used when he was telling her something he wanted her to remember. Sarah, knowledge is power, but sometimes it's a secret that saves you. She had thought he was talking about farming. She bent down and picked up the book. Richard said, "The books are donated, Sarah. You don't need to go through the..." She put it under her arm. She said, "This one's mine." She picked up her suitcase with her other hand. She walked to her car. She did not look back at Richard. She did not look back at Brenda on the porch, or the strangers in the orchard, or the iron gate with its new lock, or the apple trees in their October color behind it. She put the suitcase in the trunk. She put the book on the passenger seat. She got in and closed the door. She sat for a moment. She thought about David reading this book on Sunday evenings, his thumb moving down the pages the way it moved when he was looking for something specific. She thought about what he had said about secrets. She thought about the particular way he had been in his last months, quieter than usual, more deliberate, the quality of a man completing something he did not want interrupted. She opened the book to page 104. The document was there, folded once, the crease still sharp, tucked between the pages as if placed there by hands that knew exactly what they were doing and where it needed to be. She unfolded it. She read the heading, Life Estate Deed. She read her name in the grantee line. She sat in the car at the end of the drive of her own farm and read what David had done for her quietly in advance, in the specific way he did everything that mattered. And she understood that Richard had been going through the study for 3 days and had sorted the books into boxes and had been thoroughly certain he had found everything there was to find. He had not read the books before he sorted them. That had been his mistake. David had been counting on it. Frances lived 3 miles from the farm. Her house was small and warm and smelled like the particular combination of coffee and old wood that Sarah had associated with Frances for 30 years. The smell of a place that had been lived in carefully by someone who understood that a home was something you tended. Sarah had been in this house for holidays and difficult afternoons and the ordinary Tuesdays of a long friendship, and she had never arrived at it the way she arrived now, with a suitcase, a book under her arm, and nothing else. Frances opened the door before Sarah reached it. She said nothing. She stepped back and let Sarah in and closed the door behind her and went to the kitchen to make tea, which was the right thing to do because it gave both of them something to do with their hands, while Sarah sat down at the kitchen table and tried to understand what the day had been. The text from Richard came at 9 o'clock that evening. It was brief and formal, the kind of message a man sends when he has decided to communicate through documentation rather than conversation. It stated that the property at the farm address was now under contract and that any unauthorized entry would be considered trespassing and would be reported to the county sheriff's office. It stated that Sarah's personal effects had been inventoried and boxed and were available for collection at the gate. It stated that the closing was scheduled for Friday and that any attempt to interfere with the transaction would result in legal action. He had signed it with his full name, Richard Edward Calloway. Sarah set her phone face down on the table. Frances sat across from her with her tea and looked at her with the expression of a woman who has known someone for a long time and understands that what is needed right now is not advice or reassurance, but simply presence. Sarah said, "He took everything, Frances. Even the apple trees aren't mine anymore." Frances said, "I know it feels that way." Sarah said, "It doesn't just feel that way. The will gives him the property. He has a will that David signed before we were married, and he has the county filing, and he has a buyer and a closing date and a text message threatening to call the police if I set foot on my own land." She said it flatly, not with despair, with the particular exhaustion of a woman who has been trying to hold something together and has encountered a force larger than her ability to hold. She looked at the window. Outside Frances's yard was dark, the elm trees visible in silhouette against the slightly lighter dark of the November sky. 3 miles away, the apple orchard was in the same dark, the trees she and David had pruned every February, the trees that had given them 30 harvests, the trees that his grandfather had planted 100 years ago, and that were now, according to the documents Richard had produced, not hers. She heard about the excavator from Harold Frances's neighbor, who called Frances's landline at 7 the next morning. He had driven past the farm on his way to town and had seen the equipment, a small excavator parked at the south end of the property near the old orchard wall. He had thought Frances would want to know. He had thought Sarah would want to know. Frances took the call in the kitchen. Sarah heard it from the guest room where she had not been sleeping. She came to the doorway. Frances turned and looked at her with the expression of a woman deciding how to say something. She said Richard has equipment at the farm, at the south end. Sarah said the anniversary garden. Frances said, I don't know what he's... Sarah said, 10 years ago, David and I buried a time capsule under the south wall. On our anniversary. A box letters photographs a bottle of the first pressing from the orchard that year. She stopped. She said, he doesn't know about the box. He's just clearing the land. He's clearing it because he wants to break ground before the closing so the buyer sees it as a development site rather than a working orchard. She sat down at the kitchen table. She said he's moving fast because he needs the money. He's not being careful. He's doing what a man does when he's running from something, and the only exit he can see is the one in front of him. Frances sat down across from her. She said, David was a careful man, Sarah. Sarah looked at her. Frances said, you've been talking about what Richard has, and what Richard knows and what Richard is doing. You haven't talked yet about what David prepared. She said it quietly, not as an argument, as a fact. She said he kept that farm for 30 years. He kept his records. He kept his books. He read that apple book of his so many times Richard called him a bookworm. She paused. He was not a man who left things to chance. He was not a man who left the people he loved unprotected. Sarah said, I've looked through the documents I have. The will is clear. Frances said, have you looked through the book? Sarah looked at the table. The apple cultivation book was there. She had set it down when she came in last night and had not touched it since. The old cloth cover, the worn spine, the pages soft from decades of Sunday evening reading. She said, I found the deed in the book. That's I have the deed. Frances said, did you check the rest of it? That night after Frances had gone to bed, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with the old lamp Frances kept there, the kerosene one, a leftover from the years when the power went out reliably every winter, the one with the warm amber light that made the kitchen feel like a different era. She opened the book. She had read the deed folded between pages 104 and 105. She had put it in the inside pocket of her coat. She had not read further. She read now. She went through the book carefully the way David had always taught her to go through anything that mattered page by page, without skipping looking at the full content, rather than searching for what she expected to find. His notes were in the margins pencil, the compact notation of a man annotating for his own reference, pruning dates, soil observations, a note about the late frost in 2019 and which trees had been affected. She turned each page. Halfway through the book, she found a small folded piece of paper tucked into the spine, a reminder about a supplier, outdated, nothing significant. She kept going. Near the back, something caught her finger. Not a document, not a note. A small piece of tape barely visible adhered to the inside of the back cover, the kind of tape used to hold something in place, clear aging slightly, the edge lifting at one corner, the way tape does when it has been there for some time and is beginning to let go. She pressed it gently. Beneath it, something had been held against the board. Something had been removed, or something was still there, hidden between the back cover and the board beneath in the space that the tape was designed to conceal. She looked at it in the amber lamplight. David had read this book every Sunday evening for 30 years. He had carried it when they moved. He had kept it on his nightstand. Richard had called him a bookworm, for it had rolled his eyes at it at family dinners, had tossed it into the discard box without a second glance because it was an old book about apple trees, and Richard had never understood why David valued it. Richard had never understood that David valued it because of what was inside it, not just the deed, something else. She looked at the tape lifting at its corner and thought about David in his last months, the particular, deliberate quality of him, the way he had moved through the house with the focused attention of a man completing something. She had read it as illness, as a man making peace with his situation. She understood it differently now. She reached for the corner of the tape. Her hand was not entirely steady. It was steady enough. She began to lift it. The tape came away slowly. Sarah worked it with the careful patience of a woman who has learned over 62 years that the things worth having are worth approaching without force. The adhesive had dried with age, and the tape lifted in small increments, pulling slightly at the board beneath, and she went slowly because she did not want to damage whatever was underneath, and because some part of her understood that this moment deserved to be approached with care. The back cover of the book was 2 layers the outer cloth worn to softness, and beneath it the board that gave the cover its structure. Between those 2 layers, in a space that would not have been visible to anyone who had not known to look for it, David had placed something flat and thin. She worked the corner of the tape free. She turned the book over and held it with the back cover facing down and pressed gently on the board, and felt the slight resistance of something that had been held in place for years and was now being asked to move. A document slid out. It was enclosed in a plastic sleeve, the kind used for preserving papers against moisture, and age sealed on 3 sides, the 4th folded under. The kind of preservation a careful man applies to something he intends to last. The paper inside was thin but intact, the typeface clear, the notary seal visible through the plastic even before she opened it. She set the book down. She held the sleeve in both hands under the kerosene lamp and looked at what it contained. Life estate deed. The heading was in the formal type of a legal document, and beneath it the language she had read once before in the deed between pages 104 and 105, but here with different terms, different specifics. The language of a document that did not merely transfer ownership, but defined the nature of it with the precision of a man who had thought through every possible challenge and prepared an answer for each one. She opened the sleeve. She unfolded the document. She read. The property was described in full, the legal description, the parcel number, the acreage, the metes and bounds of the farm that David's grandfather had built and David's father had maintained, and David himself had worked for 30 years before illness had begun to take from him the strength to do it. Every tree, every building, every fence line, and then the operative language in the clear declarative sentences of a document written to be unambiguous. The grantor hereby conveys to Sarah Ann Calloway a life estate interest in the above-described property. The life tenant shall have the right to occupy, use, and enjoy the property for the duration of her natural life. No conveyance, sale, transfer, or encumbrance of the property shall be valid or enforceable without the express written consent of the life tenant. Any transaction conducted without such consent is void ab initio and of no legal effect. She read it twice. She read the date 10 years ago, the year of their 20th anniversary, the year they had buried the time capsule under the south wall with the letters and the photographs and the first pressing from the orchard. He had done this on their anniversary. He had filed a deed and buried a box and called it a celebration, and she had not known then or since that the celebration had included building a legal structure around her that no one could dismantle without her permission. She read the notary's seal, the county recorder's stamp, the filing number. This document had been recorded. It was in the county records. It had been there for 10 years waiting. She turned to the back page. David's signature in the full version of his handwriting, not the abbreviated signature he used for checks and ordinary documents, but the complete version, the one she had seen on their marriage certificate and their mortgage and every important paper of their shared life. Clear, deliberate, the signature of a man who wanted there to be no question about who had signed this and what he had intended. And in the margin beside the signature in pencil, smaller than the legal text written in the personal notation hand, she recognized from 30 years of grocery lists and Sunday evening marginal notes in this same book. Richard will look for the will. He won't look for the book. She sat with that for a moment. David had known. He had known with the specific, unhurried clarity of a man who has observed his brother for 50 years and understands without bitterness the precise shape of what his brother is. He had known what Richard would do when he was gone. He had known how Richard would do it, the speed, the old will, the certainty of a man who believes he has been thorough. He had known that Richard would go through the study and find what Richard expected to find and would not look for what Richard did not expect. He had made sure the most important document was in the last place Richard would look. The book Richard had called proof of David's bookishness. The book Richard had rolled his eyes at over 30 years of family dinners. The book Richard had tossed into the discard box without opening because it was an old book about apple trees, and Richard had never understood why David kept it. Richard had never understood that David kept it because of what was inside it. Sarah thought about something David had said to her once, not recently, years ago, in the easy conversational way of a man saying something true, rather than momentous. The most important paper is always the last one found, Sarah. The one you weren't looking for. That's the one that holds. She had thought he was talking about farming, about the way records worked, about the value of documentation. She had filed it away in the part of her mind that kept things she did not yet fully understand. She understood it now. She turned back to the front of the document, to the first page, to the section that had been added beneath the legal formalities, a separate paragraph set apart from the operative language in a slightly different typeface that suggested it had been added during the drafting process at David's specific instruction. It read, "To my wife Sarah, this is your fortress. I built it quietly because quiet was the only way it would hold. You have worked this land beside me for 30 years. You know it the way I know it, by the specific weight of the soil after rain, by the smell of the trees in late summer, by the sound the wind makes when it comes through the ridge. This land is yours in every way that matters. I am making sure the law agrees. No one can remove you from our home, not while this paper exists, and this paper will exist as long as the county recorder keeps its records, which is to say always. Come home, Sar. I've taken care of it. With all my love, David." She read it once. She set it down on the table in front of her. She pressed her hands flat on the surface and looked at the kerosene lamp and let the light it made, the warm amber light of an old instrument, the kind that burns steadily and without modern assistance, be what it was. He had called it a fortress. He had built it 10 years ago and kept it in a book he knew Richard would never open, and left a note in the margin confirming what he had known and prepared for. And then he had gone on living beside her for 10 years without telling her any of it, because he had not wanted her to carry it, because he had wanted the years between the building and the needing to be years she lived without the shadow of what was coming. She thought about the Sunday evenings, David in his chair with the apple book, his thumb moving down the pages. She had thought he was reading about pruning schedules and soil composition and the management of late-season blight. He had been sitting with his fortress, keeping it company, making sure it was still there. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She straightened in her chair. She looked at the document on the table in front of her, at the county seal, the notary's mark, the filing number that meant it was in the public record, and had been for 10 years waiting. She was not the woman who had been told to leave. She was not the woman without children, without rights, without standing. She was not Richard's version of her, the dispensable, the inconvenient, the one who had overstayed her welcome in someone else's family. She was the life tenant of a 42-acre apple orchard that had been in the Calloway family for 100 years, and her name was on a document in the county records that said so, and no sale Richard had conducted or was conducting or intended to conduct was legally worth the paper it was printed on. Richard had sold something that was not his to sell. She picked up her phone. She found the number she had looked up the day after David's funeral, the one she had saved under Dee's lawyer, without using it, the one she had been meaning to call, and had not yet called because the week had been too full of grief to add anything else to it. She pressed call. It rang twice. A voice older measured the voice of a man who answered his phone at 11 in the evening without irritation, because he had been in this work long enough to know that the calls that came at 11 were often the ones that mattered. "This is White." Sarah said, "Mr. White, my name is Sarah Calloway, David Calloway's wife. I need to talk to you about a life estate deed that my husband filed 10 years ago. I believe Richard is attempting to sell property that legally cannot be sold, without my consent." A pause. Brief, the pause of a man receiving information and processing it quickly. "Then, Mrs. Calloway, I've been hoping you would call. Can you come to my office first thing tomorrow?" She looked at the document on the table, at David's signature, clear and deliberate, at the note in the margin in his pencil handwriting. She said, "I'll be there at 8. The closing was scheduled for 10 o'clock. Sarah knew the address because Frances had found it the office of the notary. Richard had retained a commercial firm in the county seat that handled property transactions with the efficient indifference of people who process documents rather than care about their meaning. Frances had called the office the previous afternoon under the pretense of confirming a separate appointment and had gotten the time and suite number without difficulty. Sarah and Mr. White arrived at 9:55. White was a man who had practiced property law for 30 years, and he moved through the world with the particular economy of someone who has learned that the most effective way to be in a room is to be entirely present in it and entirely unperformative about that presence. He was 60 years old, compact, with reading glasses and a leather briefcase that had been good quality when he bought it 20 years ago and had become better quality since, in the way that things made to last improve with use rather than declining. He had read the life estate deed the previous evening within 30 minutes of Sarah arriving at his office. He had looked at it with the focused attention of a professional encountering a document he respected, and when he finished, he had set it on his desk and looked at Sarah over his reading glasses and said, "David filed this himself. He didn't tell me he was doing it. He just did it." Sarah had said, "That sounds like him." White had said, "It is a valid recorded instrument. It predates any sale Richard has arranged by 10 years. The transaction Richard is attempting to complete tomorrow is legally void. He does not have the authority to transfer clear title, because the title is not clear it has been encumbered by this life estate since the date of filing." He had paused. He had said he either did not know this deed existed or he chose to proceed without disclosing it. Either way, the buyers have been sold something that cannot be delivered, and Richard has exposed himself to significant liability. He had picked up his pen. He had said, "Shall we be at the closing tomorrow?" The conference room was on the 3rd floor. It had the particular quality of rooms designed for financial transactions: a long table, leather chairs, a credenza with a coffee setup, large windows looking out over the courthouse across the street. Everything polished, everything designed to communicate that serious business happened here and that the serious business was proceeding smoothly. Richard was already at the table when Sarah and White came through the door. He was in the dark jacket again, the closing jacket she thought the one he had put on the day he opened the gate to strangers. He had a folder in front of him, and a pen already in his hand, and the relaxed posture of a man who has arrived at the conclusion of something and is waiting for the formality of completion. Brenda was beside him in a cream-colored blazer. She had dressed for this. She was dressed for the celebration that was scheduled to follow the signing. The buyers' representatives were across the table, 2 of them both in their 40s, both with the polished anonymity of corporate real estate professionals who move through transactions rather than living in them. They had their own documents, their own folder, their own pen. The notary, a thin man of about 50 with wire-rimmed glasses, was at the head of the table. Richard looked up when the door opened. He saw Sarah. He saw White. His expression moved through several things in quick succession: surprise, irritation, the recalibration of a man encountering an unexpected variable and deciding how to handle it. He settled on the version of himself that was confident enough not to be rattled by the appearance of a grieving widow and her lawyer. He said, "Sarah, I don't know what you think you're going to accomplish here." She did not answer him. She walked to the table and pulled out the chair across from the notary and sat down. White took the chair beside her and set his briefcase on the table and opened it with the unhurried efficiency of a man who is not concerned about time because time is currently working in his favor. Richard said, "This closing is a private proceeding. You don't have." White said, "Mrs. Calloway has standing in this proceeding. She is a party of material interest to the transaction you are attempting to complete. She has a right to be present." He said it in the tone he used for everything, the measured, low-register delivery of a man who does not raise his voice, because raising it would suggest he believed he needed to. Richard looked at his own attorney, who was seated beside him and who had been looking at White with the attentive expression of a professional trying to assess what he was dealing with. Richard said, "She's trying to delay this. She has no legal standing to—" White reached into his briefcase. He placed the life estate deed on the table, not toward Richard, toward the notary. He set it in front of the man whose job it was to verify that the documents being signed reflected a legitimate transfer of clear title, and he set it the way you set something you are not concerned about, flatly, without drama, in the manner of a man presenting a fact rather than making an argument. He said, "This is a life estate deed for the property described in today's transaction. It was executed and recorded 10 years ago by David Calloway, the property's former owner. It grants Sarah Ann Calloway a life estate interest in the property. Under the terms of this instrument, no conveyance, sale, or transfer of the property is valid without Mrs. Calloway's written consent. He looked at the notary. He said, "I would ask you to verify the filing number against the county recorder's records before proceeding." The notary picked up the deed. He read it. He read it with the attention of a man whose professional responsibility has just encountered something he did not expect and is taking the time to understand it fully. He turned to the second page. He found the filing number. He found the date. He found the county recorder's stamp. He set the document down. He removed his glasses. He looked at Richard. He said, "I need to pause this proceeding pending verification of the county record." The room changed. The change was not loud. It did not announce itself. It was the change of a room in which everyone present has simultaneously understood that the situation is not what it was 30 seconds ago, and in which the people most affected by that understanding are still in the process of deciding what to do with it. Richard stood up. He reached across the table toward the deed. White's hand came down over it, not quickly, precisely, the hand of a man who anticipated the reach and was already there. White said, "This is a recorded original document, Richard. Removing it or damaging it in a legal proceeding would compound your situation considerably." Richard said, "That document is," White said, "registered with the county recorder 10 years ago. Filing number 2014-CR-4471. I spoke with the recorder's office this morning and confirmed that the record is intact and current. You may verify it yourself from any county terminal." Richard's hand withdrew. Brenda beside him had gone very still. She had dressed for a celebration and was sitting in a room that had stopped being a celebration, and her stillness was the stillness of a woman recalculating everything. The buyer's representatives were looking at Richard, not with the neutral professional expression they had arrived with something else, the sharp, focused attention of people who have just understood that the transaction they came here to complete may not be completable, and whose next questions are about what that means for the money they have already committed. The senior of the two said, "Mr. Calloway, is there a title issue with this property?" Richard said, "It's being handled." The man said, "Is the title clear or isn't it?" Richard did not answer. The man turned to his colleague. A brief exchange low enough that Sarah could not hear the words but did not need to. She could see the exchange. She could see what it meant. Sarah looked at Richard. He was still standing. He had the look of a man who has been moving fast in one direction and has encountered a wall that was not on his map, not fallen, not finished, but stopped, which is a different thing, and in some ways worse, because it requires him to account for the wall rather than simply absorbing the impact. She said, "Richard, you sold my orchard. Now explain to the buyers why you lied to them." She said it quietly, without sharpness, without triumph. The way David had always said the things that mattered plainly once in the register of something that does not need emphasis because its truth is sufficient. Richard looked at her. He looked at her with the specific expression of a man who has spent 30 years underestimating a person and has arrived at the moment when the underestimation has produced its full accounting. The notary said, "I'm suspending this closing pending legal review of the title. I'd recommend all parties consult with counsel before proceeding." He began collecting his documents. Across the table, the buyer's representative was already on his phone. White gathered his briefcase and stood. He leaned towards Sarah and said quietly, "You can go home now, Mrs. Calloway." She looked at the window. The courthouse across the street, its flag moving in the November wind. The ordinary business of a county seat on an ordinary morning, proceeding without any awareness of what had just happened in a conference room on the 3rd floor. She thought about David reading the Apple book on Sunday evenings, his thumb moving through the pages, keeping company with what he had built. She picked up her coat. She stood. She walked out of the room without looking at Richard again. She did not need to. The notary made his call to the county recorder's office from the conference room with everyone present. He dialed, identified himself, gave the filing number White had provided, and waited. The room was quiet in the specific way of rooms where multiple people are listening to one side of a conversation and reading the outcome in the quality of the pauses. The notary wrote something on his notepad. He said thank you and ended the call. He looked at the table. He said the life estate deed is confirmed as recorded. Filing number 2014-CR-4471, recorded 10 years ago in the name of Sarah Ann Calloway as life tenant. The record is current and unencumbered. The property cannot be conveyed without the life tenant's written consent. He closed his notepad. He said this closing cannot proceed. The buyer's senior representative, the one who had been on his phone since White placed the deed on the table, stood up. He was a man of about 50 who had spent his career in commercial real estate and had developed through that career the specific patience of someone who has learned that anger in a transaction is expensive and precision is cheap. He was not angry now. He was precise. He said, Mr. Calloway, my company has deposited $480,000 in escrow based on representations you made about the legal status of this property. Those representations were incorrect. Whether they were incorrect because you did not know about this deed or because you chose not to disclose it, the result is the same. We are entitled to the return of our deposit plus costs plus damages for the time and resources we have committed to this transaction. He said it the way a man reads a prepared statement, not improvised, not emotional, the language of someone who has already spoken to his own legal team and is now delivering the conclusion of that conversation. Richard said the deed can be challenged. It's 10 years old. White said David was in full legal health at the time of signing. The deed is accompanied by a notarized statement of independent intent. I have the documentation. Any challenge would fail. Richard said you don't have... White said I have everything, Richard. David was my client for 22 years. He was thorough. The room absorbed this. Richard sat down. The motion had the quality of a man whose legs have decided something his mind has not yet agreed to, the involuntary sit of someone whose position has given way beneath him. Brenda said, Richard, we need to call our attorney right now. Richard said, shut up, Brenda. She looked at him. He said, you're the one who said the old will was enough. You're the one who said there was no point waiting, that we needed to move before. Brenda said, don't you dare put this on me. White said to the room generally in the tone of a man who has heard enough of this particular conversation, I have one more item to address. The room went quiet. White reached into his briefcase. He produced a second folder thinner than the first, but carried with the same unhurried certainty. He placed it on the table and opened it. He said, in preparing Mrs. Calloway's case, I reviewed the documents submitted as part of this transaction. Several supplementary filings, including a spousal acknowledgement form and a secondary property declaration, bear a signature attributed to Sarah Ann Calloway. He looked at Sarah. He said, Mrs. Calloway, did you sign any documents related to this property sale? She said no. He turned back to the table. He said Mrs. Calloway did not sign these documents. A forensic document examiner reviewed the signatures yesterday evening and has provided a preliminary finding of forgery. The signatures were not produced by Mrs. Calloway. They were produced by someone who had access to her signature and attempted to replicate it. He closed the folder. He said, we have filed a report with the county sheriff's office. I was informed this morning that officers are available to take statements. A knock at the conference room door. The door opened. 2 officers, not in a hurry, in the manner of people who have been told what they are walking into and have come prepared for a civil procedural encounter rather than a dramatic one. They introduced themselves to the room. They asked politely if Richard Calloway and Brenda Calloway were present. Richard stood again. This time the motion was different, the stand of a man performing composure for an audience buying time for a recalibration that was not coming. He said, this is David would never have wanted. Sarah said, Richard. He looked at her. She said, David didn't do this to you. Your greed did this to you. She said it quietly without sharpness or satisfaction, the way she said things that were simply true. He said, I'm his blood. I'm the only family he... She said, blood isn't in the DNA, Richard. It's in how we treat each other. David taught me that. He tried to teach you? She did not say anything further. Brenda had moved toward the door during the exchange, the slow, incremental movement of a woman attempting to reposition herself without appearing to reposition herself, the kind of motion that becomes visible precisely because of its attempt at invisibility. The notary's assistant, who had been standing near the credenza throughout, stepped to the door with the quiet effectiveness of someone who had been watching for exactly this and had been told beforehand what to do if it happened. Brenda stopped. She looked at the assistant. She looked at the officers. She looked at Richard, who was being spoken to by one of them, and was not looking back at her. She sat down in her chair with the specific deflated motion of a woman who has understood that the exit she was moving toward is not available. "Ah!" Sarah stood at the window. The courthouse across the street was going about its ordinary business people on the steps, a delivery truck at the side entrance, the flag moving in the November wind. Below her on the street, the ordinary morning of a county seat that did not know what had happened in this building in the last hour. She watched Richard and Brenda leave the building. Not loudly, not dramatically, in the measured way of a legal proceeding accompanied by officers, with the particular quality of people who have arrived somewhere they cannot leave on their own terms. She did not feel what she had expected to feel. She had expected somewhere in the back of her thinking a version of satisfaction, the specific clarifying satisfaction of a wrong made right, of a person who has been treated as dispensable, discovering that they are not. She had expected something large and definitive. What she felt was smaller and more durable, the feeling of a weight set down, of something that had been pressing against her since the moment she stood at the locked gate with chrysanthemums in her hand, releasing not all at once, not dramatically, but the way pressure releases from a thing that has been holding it for too long and has finally been permitted to let it go. David had said once she could hear it now with the specific clarity that his voice had taken on since his death, each memory arriving fully rather than partially. Blood isn't about who shares your name. It's about who shows up, who stays, who does the quiet work of loving someone when there's nothing in it for them. He had been talking about her. He had been talking without saying so directly about the 30 years she had spent on that land working beside him, making something that outlasted the seasons, and about Richard, who had not once shown up for the quiet work and had appeared at the end to claim the reward. White came to stand beside her. "He said the sheriff will want a statement from you this afternoon. I can go with you." She said yes. "He said the buyer's deposit will go into escrow pending the fraud investigation. Richard's legal exposure is considerable. Whatever happens in the criminal proceeding, the civil case will be substantial." She said, "I understand." He said after a moment, "David filed that deed on your 20th anniversary. Did you know?" She said, "I found out last night. He said he came to my office the following week. He didn't tell me what he'd done. He just asked me to keep his general file current." He said. White paused. He said that a good plan is the kind you don't have to explain. If it needs explaining, it wasn't built right. Sarah looked at the courthouse across the street, at the ordinary November morning proceeding without ceremony. She said, "That sounds like him." White said, "It does." She picked up her coat from the chair. She was going home. The drive back to the farm took 20 minutes. Sarah drove it the way she had driven it for 30 years, the 2-lane county road, the elm trees, the Henderson's mailbox with the painted rooster, the gentle slope where the valley opened. She had driven this road in grief and in ordinary contentment, and in the middle of the worst week of her life. And now she drove it in the particular quiet of a person who has come through something and is returning to where they belong. She had the lockbox key in her coat pocket. White had arranged for the county to formally notify Richard that the property was Sarah's and that his lock had no legal standing. She had the court order in her briefcase on the passenger seat. She had everything she needed. The farm appeared at the end of the road the way it always appeared. The stone gate posts, the iron gate, the orchard rows beginning at the property line and running to the ridge. The apple trees in their November state leaves gone, the last fruit of the season still hanging on a few branches in the particular dark red of late-season apples that have had their frost. She parked at the gate. She got out. She stood for a moment with her hand on the iron gate the way she had stood at it 3 days ago, but different now, the difference between a person locked out and a person who has come home. She took the new padlock Richard had installed and removed it. It came off easily. It had not been there long enough to settle into the iron, the way the old hardware had settled, the way things settle when they belong somewhere, and have been there long enough for belonging to become physical. She had brought the old lock from Frances's house, the one David had made himself 20 years ago, in the way David made things carefully with attention to how it would work and how long it would last. She fitted it back onto the gate, and it went on with the ease of something returning to its right place. She opened the gate. She walked in. The orchard was the same. This was the thing she had not been certain of, whether the days of strangers and clipboard men and the particular violence of a transaction that should never have been initiated would have changed something in the quality of the place. Whether a farm could feel the difference between being tended and being assessed. The trees were the same, row after row of them, the November bare branches in their particular winter architecture, the structure of them visible now that the leaves were gone, the way a tree in winter shows you its actual shape rather than its dress shape, the skeleton of what it is and how it has grown. She walked the first row. She put her hand on the bark of the third tree, the old one, the one David's grandfather had planted when he built the first orchard, the one that had been producing for 100 years, and had the trunk circumference of a tree that has spent a century becoming itself. The bark was rough under her palm, cold and rough and solid in the way of things that have been standing long enough to stop being uncertain about it. She said quietly to the tree, to the orchard, to whatever persisted of David in the land he had worked, "I'm back." Harold came at noon. He had seen her car at the gate from the road and had turned around and come back, which was the kind of thing Harold did, because Harold had known David since they were young men and had understood without being told that what was happening this week was wrong. He brought 2 more neighbors with him. Between the 4 of them, Sarah and Harold and the Petersons from the next property over, they moved her things back into the house in 2 hours. Not dramatically, not with ceremony. The way neighbors do things for each other in places where people have lived alongside each other long enough for helping to be a reflex rather than a decision. Mrs. Peterson said, carrying a box of kitchen things through the front door, "We knew this place couldn't be without you, Sarah. Anyone who knows this farm knows that." Sarah said, "Thank you, Ruth." She meant it in the full sense. In the late afternoon, when the others had gone and the house was restored to the shape of a house that was lived in rather than emptied, she went to the south wall. The excavator had been removed. White had arranged that as well, part of the emergency injunction that had halted Richard's operations the previous evening. The ground near the wall was disturbed, the grass torn where the equipment had been positioned, but the wall itself was intact, and the soil beneath the oldest apple tree at its base had not been reached. She found a spade in the equipment barn. She dug carefully at the base of the tree in the spot she and David had marked 20 years ago with a flat stone that was still there, slightly shifted but present. The box was 18 inches down, metal sealed smaller than she remembered, the way things from 20 years ago are always smaller than memory makes them. She lifted it out and set it on the ground and sat beside it and opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth against the moisture, a bottle. The first pressing from the orchard 20 years ago, the year they had planted the tree. They were now sitting under the year they had agreed to bury something and come back to it when the time was right. And beneath the bottle a folded note, David's handwriting. Not the formal script of the deed or the careful notation of the margin note. His personal hand, the loose, familiar writing of a man leaving a message for someone he expects to find it. She unfolded it. "For the day you beat Richard, I know you will. You always understood this land better than he did. You understood it because you loved it, and he could never figure out how to love anything that didn't pay him back immediately. Keep the orchard sour, keep the first pressing, open it on a good evening when the work is done and the trees are in their color and everything is the way it's supposed to be. I'll be there in the apples. All my love, Dee." She sat under the apple tree with the note in her hands and the bottle beside her, and the November afternoon going quiet around her, the fields, the rows of trees, the stone gate posts at the property line, the ordinary, beautiful permanence of a piece of land that had been tended for 100 years by people who understood that tending was itself a form of love. She had not cried since Monday. She cried now not from grief, or not only from grief, but from the overwhelming specific weight of being known, of being loved by someone who had thought further ahead than the immediate, and had left her in a rusted tin box under the floor of a granary and a time capsule under the oldest apple tree, the evidence of a man who had believed in her before she knew she needed to be believed in. She let herself feel it. The orchard held the quiet around her. David had said, "I'll be there in the apples." The apples were still on the branches. He was there. The afternoon was going toward dusk when Sarah opened the bottle. She sat with her back against the trunk of the oldest apple tree, the one David's grandfather had planted, the one with the trunk she could not wrap her arms around, the one that had been producing fruit for 100 years and showed no signs of stopping. The ground was cold beneath her, the November soil firm, with the beginning of the season's deep chill, and she did not mind it. She had sat on this ground before in better weather and worse, and the ground was familiar in the way that places you have loved for a long time become familiar, not comfortable exactly, but right. She poured a small amount into the tin cup she had found in the time capsule box beside the bottle. The liquid was dark, the color of old amber, and it smelled the way the first pressing had always smelled, sharp and sweet and specific to this orchard, to these trees, to the particular combination of soil and water and 30 years of David's attention. She drank it slowly. She sat with the quiet of the orchard in late November, the bare branches in their winter architecture, the last apples dark against the gray sky, the rows of trees running to the ridge, the farm in its honest state undressed of summer, showing her what it actually was. She said quietly to the tree behind her, to the orchard around her, to whatever David had become, in the land he had loved. "You planned all of it, didn't you? You knew he would never touch the book." She had been thinking about it since the conference room, since White placed the deed on the notary's table, and she watched Richard's face move through its sequence of colors. She had been assembling the pieces the way you assemble something you have been looking at for a long time and have finally found the pattern of. David had left the old will where Richard would find it, not by accident, not by oversight. He had left a 31-year-old document in his desk drawer, the obvious place, the first place a man like Richard would look, the place that rewarded exactly the kind of quick, confident search that Richard's nature inclined him toward. He had left it there, as the thing to find the document that would confirm what Richard had already decided was true, the discovery that would make Richard feel he had been thorough. A man who believes he has found everything stops looking. David had known that. She thought about the last 2 years of his life. He had been ill, not severely, not in the way that takes a man out of his days immediately, but ill in the way that requires a person to think about the future with more urgency than they had before. She had watched him in those years and had read him as a man making peace with his situation, the specific inward quality of someone settling accounts, finishing things, preparing for an ending. She had been right about that. She had not known the full shape of what he was preparing. She thought about the family dinners in those years when Richard had come to the farm with Brenda and had been, as Richard always was, subtly dismissive of David's attachment to the land and his books and his Sunday evening reading. Richard had called him a bookworm since they were boys, had rolled his eyes at the apple cultivation book, specifically the old cloth-covered thing that David carried from room to room and consulted like a reference. Richard had once said in front of both of them that only a man with nothing better to do would read a farming manual for pleasure. David had laughed. Sarah remembered the laugh now with a different understanding than she had had at the time. She had read it as the patient laugh of a man accustomed to his brother's dismissiveness, absorbing it the way he absorbed other difficult things, with the steady equanimity of someone who has decided not to spend energy on what cannot be changed. She understood now that it had also been the laugh of a man who had just watched his plan confirm itself. Richard would never look inside the book. Richard had told him so himself in front of a witness over a family dinner table. The greatest enemy of greed, David had said, once she could hear it, Now the specific dry quality of his voice when he was saying something he had thought about carefully and was delivering in the most compressed possible form is silence and thorough preparation. He had been silent about the deed for 10 years. He had been thorough about everything. She thought about the medical appointment she had found in his calendar 3 years ago, a notation she had read as a routine checkup with a specialist she didn't recognize. She had not thought to ask about it at the time. She thought about it now, with the retroactive understanding of someone who has learned to read the architecture of a plan the independent physician consulted at the time of the deed signing, who had documented his full cognitive capacity for exactly the reason White had described. Richard would claim impairment. David had foreclosed the claim. He had played the long game on every front. She thought about the margin note in the book, "Richard will look for the will. He won't look for the book." Written in pencil in the personal notation hand, not for anyone else but perhaps for himself, a man confirming that the plan was sound, that the logic held that the piece he was counting on was the piece he understood completely. He had understood Richard completely. He had also understood Sarah completely. The deed was in the book not just because Richard wouldn't look there, but because Sarah would. Because David had spent 30 years watching his wife read, watching her pay careful attention to things other people dismissed, watching her find value in what was overlooked. He had known that if Sarah received the book, if the book reached her hands, rather than a donation bin, she would hold it carefully. She would notice the tape. She would look. He had made the plan that fit who she actually was. She whispered, "You built it for me specifically, not just a hiding place, a test I could pass." The orchard was quiet around her. The afternoon light had gone to its last angle, the low sideways light of November at dusk, the light that found the color still left in the few remaining apples and turned it to something luminous. She had always loved this light. David had always pointed it out when it came. "There it is, Sar, the light that shows you what's actually there." She poured a second small amount into the tin cup. She held it without drinking for a moment. She thought about Richard in those last family dinners, dismissing David's questions, finishing his sentences, treating him with the particular condescension of a man who has decided he is the more capable person in a room and is not concealing the decision. She had watched David absorb it with patience and what she had always read as the weariness of a man too tired to correct people anymore. She understood now it had been something else, not weariness, not defeat. The specific, focused stillness of a man completing a plan who has decided that the most valuable thing he can do is not correct his opponent, but allow him to remain precisely as wrong as he is. Richard had believed David was diminished. Richard had needed David to be diminished, needed it enough that he had seen diminishment, even where it wasn't there, had interpreted David's stillness as confusion and his patience as weakness and his love of an old book as the harmless eccentricity of a man losing his sharpness. It was the only mistake that had mattered. A small bird landed on the branch above her. A chickadee, the kind that stayed through winter, that did not leave when the season turned hard, that found what it needed in the bare trees and the cold air without requiring the conditions to be easier. It sat on the branch for a moment and regarded her with the bright, specific attention of a small thing that is entirely present in its world. Then it sang, one clear note and then a phrase, the particular winter song of a bird that has decided to be here and is saying so. Sarah looked up at it. She thought about the time capsule note. "For the day you beat Richard. I know you will." He had written it 20 years ago. He had buried it under the oldest tree and left it there for 2 decades, waiting for the day it would be needed, the day she would sit under this tree and read it and understand that he had believed in her outcome before she had known there would be an outcome to believe in. She said to the branch, to the bird, to the last of the dusk light on the orchard, "You were always 10 steps ahead, even at the end." The bird sang again. She finished the last of the first pressing from the year they were married. It tasted like the orchard in its best season, the specific sweetness of 100-year-old land and 30 years of careful tending, and everything they had built here together preserved in a bottle and buried under a tree, and opened on the evening she came home. David had said he would be there in the apples. She believed him. 1 year later, the apple trees were in bloom. The orchard in May was a different thing from the orchard in November. Not better, not worse, just the other face of itself. The face that came after the bare winter months and announced that what had looked finished was not finished at all. The blossoms came every year in the second week of May, white and pink in varying proportions depending on the variety covering the rows of trees, in the particular abundance of a living thing that has been tended well and is returning the investment of that care. Sarah walked the rows in the morning the way she had walked them every morning for 30 years. She carried the apple cultivation book, not because she needed to consult it. She had the knowledge in her hands by now, the 30 years of it. The way things you have done long enough stop being learned and start being embodied. She carried it the way you carry something that has become part of how you understand yourself. The old cloth cover worn to softness, the pages soft from decades of handling, the space between the back cover boards where the deed had waited 10 years for the morning she needed it. She carried it because it was David's, and carrying it was a form of keeping him present, and she was not ready to stop doing that, and did not think she ever would be. The classes had begun in February. 8 women from the county, some with land of their own, some without, all of them interested in the particular knowledge that comes from learning to grow, something that takes years to establish and decades to fully produce. Sarah had advertised in the county extension newsletter and at the feed store and at the library in town, and 8 women had come on the first Saturday morning and sat at the table in the barn with their coffee and their notebooks and their questions. She had not planned it as a memorial to David. It had grown into one. She taught them what he had taught her, not just the practical knowledge, the pruning and the grafting and the soil management and the reading of weather, but the philosophy underneath it. The understanding that an orchard is not a transaction, that it cannot be approached as something to extract value from and move on, that the relationship between a person and a piece of land that grows fruit is a long-term commitment requiring patience and attention and the willingness to do work whose rewards will not arrive for years. She taught them the way David had taught her, by doing it alongside them, by showing them the trees and letting the trees teach them things that could not be conveyed in any other way. By April, 3 of the 8 had brought their daughters. The community garden occupied the south corner of the property, the area near the old stone wall, near the spot where the time capsule had been buried, and where the excavator had been positioned before the injunction stopped it. Sarah had cleared the area and prepared the soil and offered it to the county extension program as a demonstration plot available to the community for educational use. The deed was still hers. The life estate was intact. She had not given the land, she had given the use of it, which was different, which was the thing David had understood when he built what he built. Ownership and use were not the same thing. You could hold something completely and still allow it to serve purposes beyond yourself. She had learned that from 30 years of apple farming. She had learned it again from the document in the tin box. On a Saturday morning in May, she was teaching 2 of the women how to read the new season's growth on the oldest trees, the indicators in the new wood that told you what the tree had stored through winter and what it was prepared to give this year when she saw the children. 3 of them from a neighboring property who had been coming to the orchard since February with their grandmother, one of the women in the class. They had found as children fine things the particular pleasure of the orchard in blossom, the way the rows of white flowers made a tunnel when you ran between them, the way the petals fell when you shook a low branch, the way the whole structure of a 100-year-old tree was different from any tree you encountered by accident. They were running the rows the way children run when they have found a place that invites it. Sarah watched them from the older section of the orchard where the trees were widest and the blossoms densest, and the history of the place was most palpable in the weight and circumference of the trunks. David's grandfather had planted these trees. David had tended them. She was tending them now, and children who had never known David were running between them and the orchard, was giving what it had always given, the specific generosity of a living thing that does not keep accounts, that offers what it has to whoever is present to receive it. This was not what Richard had tried to sell. Richard had tried to sell 42 acres and the structures on them. He had tried to convert 100 years of accumulated life into a number on a development spreadsheet. He had tried to do it quickly, with a document he had not examined carefully enough, and a plan that depended on speed, and on a woman's grief making her easier to manage. He had not understood what the land actually was. David had understood. In the afternoon, she framed the deed. She had been meaning to do it for months and had kept putting it off not from reluctance, but from the sense that the right moment had not arrived. The right moment arrived on a May afternoon with the orchard in bloom and children in the rows and the light through the kitchen window at its best spring angle. She used a simple frame, plain wood, clean glass, the kind that held something without making a fuss about holding it. She placed the life estate deed in the center, matted in white David's signature, visible at the bottom beside the notary's seal. She hung it in the front room, not hidden, not decorative in the way of something without meaning. Present, the document that said in the formal language of a county recorder's office what David had always meant, that this was her home, that she had the right to be here for as long as she lived, that no one could take it from her. She stood back and looked at it. Then she went outside. The evening came the way May evenings come, slowly, warmly, the light taking its time over the orchard and the fields and the ridge at the back of the property. Sarah stood in the middle of the oldest row, the one where David's grandfather's trees stood, and she held the apple book in both hands and looked up through the blossoms at the sky. She said quietly to the trees, to the blossoms, to the 100 years of careful tending that had produced this specific beauty on this specific evening, "Your love wasn't just a piece of paper, David. It's the roots of these trees. It doesn't die." The orchard was quiet. The last light moved through the blossoms, the way last light always moved through them, slowly changing the white to gold for a few minutes before the gold gave way to the soft dark of a May evening that had decided to be gentle. A bird sang somewhere in the upper branches. She stood with the book in her hands and the light on the blossoms, and the children's laughter from the direction of the south garden still faintly audible, and she let herself feel the full weight of what David had given her, not just the legal protection, not just the deed in its frame on the front room wall, but the understanding behind it. The specific, quiet understanding of a man who had loved her enough to think further ahead than the immediate, who had prepared for her future, with the same careful attention he brought to the orchard, who had believed in her ability to find what he had left before she had known there was anything to find. "As long as you are here," he had told her once, "standing in this same spot in a different season, I will never truly be gone." She was here. The orchard was here. The deed was on the wall. The first pressing was opened and gone drunk under the oldest tree on the evening she came home tasting of 30 years of a life built carefully and well. And the land, the 100-year-old land that Richard had tried to sell and could not, that David had protected and she had defended, and that was now producing its blossoms for the 10,000th spring, was doing what it had always done. Growing. She turned and walked back to the house. The kitchen light was warm in the window. The orchard was behind her, quiet and full and entirely itself. She went inside and closed the door. She was home. She had always been home. David had made sure the county agreed.